Of course.
All right, folks, I want to welcome our guest to the show. I want to welcome our guest to the show. It's Ryan Edwards. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Hello, everyone.
I'm glad to have you on, man. So let's get right into it. I know you've written a book about cryptids in the past. So let's start a little bit about your background. Tell us what got you into the subject, what you've been doing, what you are doing, and let's walk into the first book. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the cryptids that you covered in that.
Of course. Well, my introduction to cryptozoology was at a young age. Like I like to say, like every young kid, they always love dinosaurs, mysteries, animals, things like that. And I had a love for all of that. So I think I fell right into the world of cryptozoology. I watched TV shows like Monster Quest as a young kid, Finding Bigfoot. There was a show on Animal Planet called Lost Tapes. I used to watch those shows, and then kind of it had me fall in love with cryptozoology. So at the age of 21, I was able to get my first book published, Cryptids of the World. And that was kind of my introduction into the actual field. I've been doing pretty much armchair research into this for the past 10 years or so, but only two field research and talking to other researchers and talking to eyewitnesses the past year or so. So with Cryptids of the World, it's kind of a modern day bestiary, almost like an encyclopedia of different cryptids around the world. A lot of it's just different names for just local names for different animals, like how people have Bigfoot and Sasquatch. It's the same creature, but it's just two different names. Or like Ohio grass mat, falcon monster. It's all just local names for Sasquatch or Bigfoot. So I have a thing 192 cryptids in there, and just it's a whole menagerie of just different animals around the world.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. I just released a show today on the Bridgewater Triangle, right? And there's so many different things that are going on in that area. There's so many different cryptids that people see. And I've been fascinated with this whole world of other cryptids. I think you just said you had 192 different types of cryptids in your first book. I don't know what to make of that, right? I've said it on the show many, many times. Like Bigfoot makes sense to me. I can put that in a I can put Bigfoot into a box, or I can check some boxes and say, this thing may be a relic hominoid. It may be a relic hominin. It may be a relic hominid. You know, there's all kinds of different things that we can talk about. And I'm sure we'll get into that here shortly. But I can sort of look at that and say, yeah, this thing could have existed at some point in time on our family tree, our very bushy family tree. And I can say, yeah, that makes sense to me. But when you start talking about Dogman, you talk about Puckwudgies and all the things that we just covered in this episode that I put out today on the Bridgewater Triangle and all of these other places around the world, I don't really know what to make of that. So let me ask you, outside of the Bigfoot thing and these other cryptids that you've put in your book and you've obviously done some studying and some research on, I guess the real question here is, if these things exist, A, how do they exist? Where do they exist when people aren't seeing them? And I guess the other part of that question is any of this real, right? That's the question that I ask myself at the end of the day all the time. You know, I've had a friend that I talked about in this recent episode that had an experience with a little person in the woods on a couple of occasions that what he described looked like a puckwudgie, right? If you're familiar with that. So I don't know how to check a box on that, but where are you on these other cryptids? Do you think these things are real? Do you think there's some sort of misidentification? Where do you think they come from? Like, what are your thoughts on all of that? I know that was a lot to throw at you, so just take it as you want.
You're good. Uh, what it That's the thing with me. I come at cryptozoology from very like scientific viewpoint, very much anthropological, paleontological. I look at ecology and zoology with it. If a certain cryptid doesn't match certain zoological and ecological laws, then their plausibility of them existing is very low. With me, cryptozoology is truly a science. Science isn't just about possibility, it's about plausibility. If an animal doesn't have a plausibility of existing, then you might have to go another route on what are people seeing. For instance, like I'll give you like puckwudgies for instance. Ecologically, a small individual like that really wouldn't fit in because if you look at the Bridgewater Triangle, there's all these other cryptids seen there. You have like Bigfoot, like I know the Dover Demon was seen in that area. You have Dogmen, Puckwudgies. If you just look at what's known there, what's the known predators and prey, and then if you add all these cryptids, ecologically that doesn't make any sense. Like I tell people all the time, like, okay, North America, let's look at all the cryptids seen around here. You have Bigfoot, Dogmen, Shukawalkins, supposed hyenas, dire dogs, like what Linda Godfrey talks about. You have all these different cryptids that are major predators. Ecologically, you can't have that many predators on one area. It just doesn't make any sense. So with these other cryptids that are seen around the world, a lot of them do fit within the zoological like box. Like, but some of them don't. Like if you look at like the dogman phenomenon, it just doesn't fit either ecologically or anatomically. It just doesn't fit in something that would evolve naturally here on Earth. That's like with me, I research all types of cryptids, but my major ones I do study are like relic hominoids because those fit within the human family tree or like somewhere along the hominoid evolution. Those are the things, those are the cryptids I try to go after the most. Because if we look at all the evidence we have for Sasquatch, we have all this evidence that has gone there for thousands of years. I believe all cryptids should be held to that standard. Like if let's just take for instance, like the chupacabra sightings only started since the 1990s. An animal can't just appear like that, not naturally. Evolution and science just doesn't work like that. So I believe with cryptids, you have to look at the history. You also have to look at the science behind it. If they don't have that science behind them, the ecological and zoological and even paleontological aspects, then you have to look at it from another perspective. Is it maybe something more on a paranormal scale? Maybe, because I know that's a viewpoint we have in cryptozoology. But just with me, that's just not what I study. I try to study physical creatures that have evolved here on Earth. And cryptozoology, I believe, is the solution to that. But we just need to look at all of the evidence for these creatures. And if the evidence isn't there for their existence, then the plausibility is highly low for their existence.
Well, I get that question a lot. I have people on the show that say they've had certain experiences with things that are outside of Bigfoot, right? We get into UFOs, we get into all kinds of things. So I guess for me, when I talk to I'm not a cryptozoologist. I don't even play one on television. All of my research is done behind the microphone, talking to people like you and talking to people who've had experiences. I've had experiences of my own I can't explain. So I'm obviously very curious about this. I do two shows that are into this subject, Bigfoot and then the paranormal. So I guess the question then for me, for you as a cryptozoologist, do you think people are making these things up? Do you think it's a misidentification? Do you think these things are maybe something outside the realm of a flesh and blood creature? Do you think it's more of a paranormal thing that people are experiencing, or maybe is it a combination of all of those?
I believe it could be a combination of all of them. Like misidentification is a big thing within this field. You talk to even the most zealous researcher, they'll tell you only maybe 10% of Bigfoot sightings are actually Sasquatch and Bigfoot. Most of them are misidentifications. People, and when fear is enacted into people, perception changes. What we see and what we perceive are two different things. Our eyes aren't cameras. Our brain isn't a tape recorder. What we remember and what we see is different from what we actually perceive in our reality. So it's like that's like one thing. Psychology has a big role to play within cryptozoology. People don't realize how much fear can affect someone's mind, especially when someone's seeing a Sasquatch. They might say, "Oh, I saw a 10-foot creature," but if you go back and talk to them in person and go back to the sighting, they realize the creature is only maybe 6 to 8 feet tall. Fear does affect people like that. But also with perception, it's all about belief as well. If people have a preconceived notion of a belief of a creature, they expect to see that creature in the reality. It's like how people say you have Bigfoot on the brain. If you believe a creature like that exists, everything you see is going to have Bigfoot dealing with it. It's like that you have a preconceived notion to it. But also just with people, some people just might see something that just isn't there. Like we know imagination does have a play in this, and also so does fear. But also some people we know hoaxes are a real thing. People do hoax and people do lie. But you do have to worry about that in this field. I don't believe it's as common as people say it is, but it's still an occurrence that happens regularly. So with investigation into any type of sighting, any type of phenomena, you always have to have that second guessing in your mind. With me, I always believe eyewitnesses, but you always have to have that second guess at the same time because you never know if someone is BSing you in the first place. So you always have to worry about that. And also, if what they're seeing is not what you're seeing, it's like I've had plenty of people walk up to me and show me a picture. I see a Bigfoot in this picture. Personally, I don't. I'm not saying that there isn't, but I don't see what you see. And that's the thing. All of our eyes are different. All of our minds work differently. If you see a Bigfoot in that picture and I don't, not necessarily that you're lying to me or you're trying to like pull something over my eyes. It's just that I don't see it there. But maybe you do. So that's just kind of the perception.
So obviously you did the first book and it covered a lot of cryptids, and then you decided to hone in on Bigfoot. I'm assuming that's because of your scientific approach to cryptozoology and the fact that Bigfoot in and of itself is probably, if not the only, it's one of the only cryptids, in my opinion, that has some validity and could actually exist. And I do believe, 5 days out of 7 that these things are real and that they do exist. I haven't seen one, right? So all I really have are these anecdotal stories and the things that people tell me as far as their experiences. And I've said before on the show, I don't have people on the show that I don't believe have had a real experience or that they believe they've experienced something, right? So you're obviously into the Bigfoot thing. Let's get into that and talk a little bit about what your opinions on these things are. Let's start with what you think they might be. Do you have an opinion on what this thing, some people say it may be Gigantopithecus or other things. What is your opinion on what these things might be?
Well, yes, because with Sasquatch, of course we know it's some type of primate. It's some type of relic hominoid. Would it? I've gone away from the giganto theory, like I know most of the community has, simply due to the fact that the main reason people thought it was giganto is due to the size and how morphologically they're similar. But that's like saying a rabbit and a chihuahua related because they're both small, furry, and have big ears. Just because something on the same size doesn't necessarily mean they're genetically related. So I believe with recent studies and have shown that Bigfoot most likely is some type of either hominin, like possibly Paranthropus or Australopithecine, or maybe more of a relic anthropoid ape. Like I've gone into the theory of maybe something like an Oreopithecus or Dryopithecus, because I believe Sasquatch is either two possible options with it. Either it's something that came in recent time that was very human like a Paranthropus or Australopithecine that's somehow found its way in North America, or it's a lot older genus than we ever expected, and it's an ape that crossed over into North America a lot longer than we expected. Maybe something during the Pleistocene or Miocene, and it's evolved here in North America and become what we now know as Sasquatch. That's one thing I want to talk about in future research. Is just what is the evolutionary history of Sasquatch? Is it something that's maybe it's something that we haven't even found in the fossil record. Most paleontologists and primatologists say we only know 10% of the primatology paleontological record. When you look at chimpanzees, we only had fossil evidence for chimpanzees in 2005. Before that, we barely even had even bones of these creatures. So it could be something from the fossil record. We have no idea what it is. Or it could be maybe something from the fossil record that has morphologically changed over the past couple 100,000 years into what we now know as Sasquatch. So with me, I do believe Sasquatch is something that's evolved here in North America, but because if you look at its adaptations, it's built for North America. Look at its feet. Look at its hand structure. It's made for a robust ape. Like if you look at the ankle structure of a Sasquatch, like if you look at Global Krontz's replicas of how the feet and how the bones would come out, their ankles are anterior to push farther up on the foot. That is exactly what an 800-pound primate's ankle would look like. So with me, I haven't had an experience with Sasquatch. I haven't had an eyewitness encounter or like heard any type of vocalizations or anything like that. But there's too much data to prove that there's a biological species behind this phenomenon for me to say, well, it can't be true. There's just too much data, too much evidence, and scientific evidence too, not even counting all the thousands and thousands of anecdotal references from Native American tribes, eyewitness testimony, video evidence, and vocalizations that are outside of the possibility of humans making it. There's just too much evidence for this creature to be a true biological species for us not to say it doesn't exist. Even though I haven't seen one, I still know it's true. It's real. It's real. Because with me, it's not about the belief that they exist. It's about because that's kind of hand in hand with faith. You have to know they exist, not using just your own eyewitness testimony, but possible just you looking at the data. The data is just too strong to show that there is a species there behind all of the setbacks.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. And I'm not going to be an asshole, right? I'm not going to, because I do believe these things are real. But here's the thing that I found myself doing recently is questioning more and more, right? The evidence. Let's talk about the evidence. I ran across something yesterday or day before yesterday when I was researching the show that I just put out, and it was on the Patterson Gimlin film. And I don't remember. I saw it on YouTube, and it's a YouTube channel, and it's all about these reasons why the Patterson Gimlin film is fake. And the first thing, of course, is this interview with Bob Hieronymus. I'm going to end up doing a show. I want to do an entire show on this, right? Because I've talked to people. I've had Jeff Meldrum on the show. I've talked to Dr. Meldrum, and we've talked about the Patterson Gimlin film. I've talked to people that have done very in-depth scientific looks at this film, and they come out and say there's muscular structure. You can see the foot, and like Jeff said, he's convinced by the footprints that were casted that day. And I recently got to see a copy of a copy of a copy of this cast, and it's impressive. But in and of itself, to me, it's not enough for me to say that that is a real live Sasquatch that I'm seeing in that film. I do believe 7 days, 5 days out of seven, that's a real creature and it is a real Sasquatch. But there's times when I don't believe it. So when you say for you that there's enough evidence out there to convince you that these things are real, I'm not there yet. So let's talk a little bit about that. What is it? Let's talk about the PG film. Is that one of those pieces of evidence for you that's convincing enough to say that that's a real creature?
It's convincing enough, but I'm like you sometimes. I look at the film, I'm like, okay, I'm like 99% sure it's a creature, but since I wasn't there when it was filmed, you always gotta have that skeptical mindset. You always gotta have that like, well, what if it's not real? Like if it's real, you always gotta have that option. Like if you're not 100% proven and you were there when it was shot, you have no idea if it was real or not. You're not Bob Giblin. You're not Roger Patterson. So we can never know for sure. But with me, I do believe that most likely it's an actual creature due to the fact, yeah, you have the muscular structure, you have certain anthropological uh, and anatomical details in the film that we wouldn't know about until late years later. For instance, the sagittal crest. If you look at most replicas of monkeys and gorilla suits at that time, they barely had a sagittal crest that you would see in whatever is shot on that film. And for instance, they've done experiments on the skull structure. It shows exactly what almost a large ape would look like a Gigantopithecus or even a Pranthropus skull. If you put Pranthropus skull over that head, it fits almost exactly in there. And if you look at the feet, for instance, not a lot of people realize if you zoom in on the feet when Patty's moving, you see the foot actually break. You see the metatarsal break. And that's something that we saw in Footprint Cast back in 2001, and only Jeff Meldrum was the one that discovered that. So you have a film from 1967 that's demonstrating an anatomical detail that we only discovered in 2001. And that's kind of an amazing detail in that. And you have, for instance, the muscular structure you see, mammary glands, which is something you wouldn't really have on a suit back in that day. And the measurements that we've done that has shown that that figure is about 7'2", 7'6", somewhere in that area. And of course, if you're two rodeo cowboys, it's hard to find a 7 foot tall person I didn't make a suit to fit that person. So the plausibility, it's kind of the crazy thing with that. It's the plausibility of it being a real creature, but then you have to have the plausibility like, is Bigfoot real? Like that's kind of the crazy thing in this research. We already know, well, we already have an idea that Sasquatch is real. So having that be a hoax, it's almost implausible for it to be a hoax because of all these details within it. So you have to kind of go on that almost implausible scale of Bigfoot's real, and we had an actual video of it back in 1967. Because there's just too many fine little details with it. Even the fur, like a lot of people back in the day when they would make fursuits, they would make almost longer hair up on the head, like how humans were. But this shows a even covering a fur very similar to what apes have. Longer fur on the head, that's a hominid trait, not that's a human trait, not a ape trait. So it's details like that just kind of show that most likely this is an actual physical creature that is walking across that sandbank.
Yeah, and most of the time I'm there with you, right? And I've seen so many different breakdowns because everything I'm taking notes as you're talking, and everything that you said, this guy that I saw on YouTube, these interviews, and I mean this stuff's like back from 1995 or something. So it's been around for a while, right? And the majority of the things that you said are disputed word for word, point by this guy. Well, this thing's not 7 feet tall. It's only 5'9". Or you can't see musculature in the legs. You can't see what people have. I think MK Davis came up and said that it looked like it'd been shot in the leg and there was an injury because of this massacre that took place. This whole
Yeah, the
other story within a story, right? And I don't get down in the minutia of that because, and I'm not trying to break your balls here because I'm right there with you, right? But
yeah,
I think it's only fair that we have an honest conversation with anybody who comes on the show. And I've sort of softballed a lot of questions in the past with people that I probably should have nailed to the wall, Todd Standing. But so my listeners are always writing in and saying, "Why didn't you ask this question? Why didn't you ask that question?" And I am a believer, and I don't want anybody to think that I'm coming across, being hard on you because I'm not a believer. I think it's just we really have to. I'm at the point now where I'm frustrated with the
yeah.
entire subject, and I want to really get down to the nitty gritty of finding the answers. And that's one of the answers that or one of the questions I've asked people over and over recently. I know other people on other shows say, "What do you think these things are?" Well, nobody knows what they are, right? You have theories and you have things that you can put out there and hypothesize, and it's all subjective. So I don't ask that question. I ask the
Yeah.
question, why is it, do you think, that we're sitting here in 2022 on June 19th and we don't have any answers? Why have we not found these things? So before we get to that question, let's talk a little bit more about the evidence. Why do you think it is that we have all these videos, we have all these photos, we have some things, we have the vocalizations, which I certainly want to talk about because I've heard what I believe to be vocalizations on my property here. And I've had people and done entire shows. Julie Wrench, David Ellis have been on my show. And we've done entire hour plus shows on just vocalizations or possible vocalizations. What do you think about the evidence that we've had so far outside of the Patterson Gimlin film? We've covered that. Let's talk about what you feel that you've seen so far that has convinced you the most, and what's the best evidence that you think we've had that actually proves the existence of these creatures?
Well, within one big piece of evidence is the footprint casts. For instance, I cannot go into detail as much as like someone like Jeff Meldrum or Cliff Barrickman, but the anatomical detail within these footprint casts is amazing. For instance, dermal ridges like dermatoglyphics. That's something that most hoaxers wouldn't really think about putting on. And of course, that's a point a lot of people bring up. And metatarsal breaks, little anatomical details that pretty much only simians would have. And if you had like a footprint cat, like a wooden footprint, like back in the day when Ray Wallace had them, wouldn't have that. The toe structure, like how they spread out, that shows a creature that hasn't worn shoes. Like if a person was walking out there, it'd probably show in straight line toe prints because people we wear shoes. it anatomically morphs our foot into a certain shape. Uh, how it shows movement and how we can actually track the footprint cast and track an individual for years. Like I know I've talked to Jeff Milton and he says up in Idaho, he knows sometimes which footprint cast goes to which individual because he's seen that footprint cast across the state. And it's kind of amazing how some people can do that because they know these footprint casts so well. But there's certain anatomical details with the footprint cast that do kind of prove it is some type of physical creature. What that is, we aren't for sure. But we can only hypothesize. Some people say it's a hominid, some people say it's a hominid. We are not for sure exactly what these creatures are until it is proven they exist. And that's one thing I always tell people. The only true scientific way to prove something exists is having a body. Like that's one thing I say as a cryptozoologist, my job really isn't to prove these creatures exist because that means either hunting one down or hopefully I get lucky and then one gets hit by a truck or something like that. And I would hate to see one of these creatures get killed. So my job really isn't to prove they exist, but it's to educate and to kind of spread the word on these creatures because the social ideas and psychologies that these creatures don't exist and that anyone that hunts Bigfoot is some type of lewd. If we can try to change that, that's what it's all up to. Or that's what I think cryptozoology and Bigfootology is up to. But there is quite a bit of evidence for these creatures. Like even one thing I look at too that is really important to me is the Native American stories of Sasquatch. Almost every tribe has its own name for a large, hey, wild man or something that lives in the woods that's human-like. And this shows a history of these creatures. And that's one thing I look at with old cryptids is there a local stories of these creatures that go back to the indigenous tribes? Like with Sasquatch, it goes back thousands of years. If we look at the hairy man pictographs on the Tule River Indian Reservation, we believe those could be between 500 and 1,000 years old, maybe even older, because you can't really age a pictograph. It's painted onto a rock, so you can't really age it, and that shows literally a life size pictograph of a Sasquatch, and it's you have the stories behind it. Well, Heyman was a giant that lived in the woods. He would roam at night because he wanted to stay away from people. He lived back in the deepest of woods to stay away from people. He would steal food at night. He would steal salmon and things from people, and he walks on two legs and all this. So there's correlation between Native American tribe stories and what we now know as Sasquatch. And that's one really big piece of evidence for me as well for the possible existence of Sasquatch.
I've dug into the history quite a bit. I've done an entire series of 4 or 5 shows here on the podcast about the history of Bigfoot. And it all goes back to some of the more well known discoveries and the more well known sightings, and obviously the Patterson Gimlin film, things like that. But I mean, there's been people in history, Teddy Roosevelt. I just did a story about that last week. Had this Native American told him a story that one of his friends was possibly killed by Sasquatch. Didn't see what did it, but he's just assuming that that's what
Yeah,
it is. And
Bauman's tale.
yeah, the Bauman's tale. It's sort of implied, right, in the story that that's what it is. But at the end of the day, I struggle because there is very little outside of the footprint evidence and the pictures and the videos and the things like that that we have that are certainly not definitive in any way. I mean, the Patterson Gimlin film, if catching one of these things on video was going to be the definitive end all be all, this question would have been answered in 1967, but to
Yeah.
this day it's not. So even with the footprint evidence, I struggle with that because, again, I go back to Meldrum. I trust his opinion and I believe what he tells me, but is it possible that somebody has figured out how to fake these footprints? And maybe it is because of this thing that we have Bigfoot on the brain. We're using what we believe and what we want to believe to fit those things into a mold that makes sense and say, yeah, we've casted this and I found this foot that's got this mid tarsal break, and therefore this had to be made by a Sasquatch. I guess that's kind of where I'm at. Like I said, I'm so upset with myself recently because I've had all these doubts about the subject, but I'm frustrated because I talk to so many people that come on the show and have these anecdotal experiences, but yet we're no closer, in my opinion, to really figuring out if these things are real or not. So I'm always grasping at straws and trying to talk to people like you who go out and do this stuff as a cryptozoologist to say, what do we really have that proves that, right? And everybody does go to the footprints, and I'm kind of that same way, with the PG film. When Meldrum said to me, he's convinced by the footprints. Well, at the time that was good enough for me. But a year later, I'm like, I don't really know if it is or not. So if we're having these footprints and all of these sightings, and these things are very elusive. That's one of the things. Obviously, the Native American people saw these things, or they wouldn't have talked about them. But they are very elusive. And then we're having people drive by in a Toyota Prius, and they almost hit this thing because it's crossing the road in front of them. Some of that just doesn't make sense to me. So how do you rationalize all of these sightings that people claim that they have versus, maybe actually 10% of them being real? And then what does that mean for the population? And where do you think these things are do you think they're prolific throughout the United States, or are you sort of in that camp of Pacific Northwest? What do you think as far as habitat?
With habitat, I look at well the research people have done. There is a correlation between precipitation and Sasquatch sightings, and also a correlation between large mammals and Sasquatch sightings. Like if you put an overlay of black bear sightings and then the overlay of Sasquatch sightings, they almost match exactly. So in me, with Sasquatch, I don't believe they just live in the Pacific Northwest. I believe they can live in other areas. Like if you look at, for instance, East Texas. East Texas is a high area of high precipitation, has a lot of woods, a lot of black bear. I believe that they could live in those areas. So places like Nebraska or Kansas, open states, we have sightings there. But with me, I believe these creatures could be highly nomadic. I believe they can move from maybe state to state, and those are the sightings we have in like Montana and Wyoming and all these other states. When it's a little bit more open area, you wouldn't expect a Bigfoot to really be able to live and persist in an environment like that. Or even in the desert, we have the Mojave Sandman, where people just report Bigfoot-like creatures out in the desert. Those are certain environments that we just don't believe a large primate would be able to persist in. But maybe they are so nomadic, they maybe move through the areas and during certain times of year. Maybe they just migratory routes. I believe there are certain like hotspots for Sasquatch, like of course Pacific Northwest, maybe the American Southeast. Like we have law sightings in Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, East Texas, because it's high precipitation, good amount of woods. People out there, they kind of stick to themselves, so it's not as much expansion into the woods as in other areas of the country. Also, I believe mountainous areas, like if you look at the Appalachian Trail, I believe the Appalachians are one big area for Sasquatch sightings. Because that could be also what we believe is a migratory route for Sasquatch. They might be able to move up and down these ridge lines and move up and down these migratory routes in these mountain ranges, and that's where they could persist the year round. Like look at also in the Sierra Nevadas. There's also a bunch of evidence for Sasquatch living in the Sierra Nevadas. That's where the Sierra sounds were made. And the Rocky Mountains as well. And the Rocky Mountains go straight up into Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, those areas. So I believe these animals they can't live everywhere across the United States. There's just no animals that generalized. Like you can't put, it would be hard to put a black bear in the middle of a desert and see if they can survive that long. Like maybe kind of hard, or even put a grizzly bear out there. But I believe they are highly adaptable, so they can move through areas like that. But I believe they would primarily persist in high precipitation, mostly maybe swamp or the redwood forests, places like that. But also you have to look at the indicators, like okay, how much precipitation does it get per year? Are there other large mammals in the area? Like, does it have the prey source, like deer, elk, things like that? Is there also large predators in the area? Like, is there a bunch of wolves or coyotes, things like that? Like bears. I believe black bears can be an indicator species for Sasquatch. They'll probably go after the same type of, because they're both generalist omnivores. They'll be going after the same type of foodstuffs and the same type of environments. So not necessarily all the times if you have a bear right there, you'd have Sasquatch in the area. That's not necessarily a rule, but it's something that we can kind of follow. Indicator species is a thing just within zoology in general. Like, okay, if we have deer, most likely we're going to have predator for the deer. So with Sasquatch, I believe it would just be things like that. And with evidence, it's kind of the funny thing too. We have so much evidence. It's like we have all these puzzle pieces, but it's like no one's really we've tried to put them together, but we can't find a complete puzzle. And maybe there's also still puzzle pieces out there we just haven't discovered yet. Maybe there's certain ways of researching this that people just haven't gone into yet. Like I'm not sure. That's the thing with Bigfoot is that we have so much evidence for it, but yet we still don't have proven scientific data that it exists. Because with me, the only way that science would really accept this creature would exist is truly a body. If they can have a body and do dissections and take DNA evidence and see where it's came from. That's the only way to truly prove these creatures exist. But how I like to say too, with all the evidence we have for Sasquatch, hell, we could probably put it on trial and probably get a guilty verdict because of how much evidence we have. But just also it's a big paradigm shift. The paradigm in most people's mindset hasn't changed. Like most people believe there can't be anything else out there that's very human-like or almost on intelligence similar to ours. They can't even perceive that yet. So I think there has to be a large paradigm shift within the scientific community towards Sasquatch and the idea of like unknown species. So I think there's certain things that have to change, not just within our field, but also the field of this regular anthropology and zoology. Because if you're a regular anthropologist or zoologist and bring up Bigfoot, that's the end of your career almost. So there has to be that change within science itself. I'm not saying science is a bad guy or science is somehow disproving Bigfoot, but just it has to have that paradigm shift within it.
Yeah, it's been one of my frustrations for so long is there's not enough Jeff Meldrums, John Bindernagels, Grover Krantzes that are left out there doing this kind of work in that sort of way. And then I think just in general, unfortunately, Bigfoot has become so hyper sensationalized by some of the shows and even mine. I've said it before. I know shows like mine probably even add to that a little bit because people are just so into the stories and it's entertaining, right? But for those of us who are serious about the subject and really want to find out what these things are, I think sometimes it does a disservice because then you start getting these Bigfoot celebrities and people that are spewing off their opinions. And it's not even opinions anymore. It's, yeah, they're migratory. They move here. They eat this. Yeah, they go there. Yeah. Well, how do you know that? What, where's the evidence to prove your hypothesis? Everybody has an opinion. Opinions are like, whatever. Everybody's got one, but you have to have proof. I've done it on my property recently. I've posted videos and pictures of things that I've went hiking on my property, and I found all kinds of things that look like stick structures. And I'm confused by that because I don't know. I've talked to friends of mine who are out in the Bigfoot community researching in the field, boots on the ground. That's not me. I hike on my property. I do as much as I can, night hikes and as much exploring as I can in audio and things like that when I have the free time. But they're boots on the ground, and I call them and I say, "Hey, I heard this vocalization is really weird. It sounded like this." And then I go hiking and I find these what look like stick structures. I posted a bunch of pictures and video, and I've got all kinds of people making comments like, "Holy shit, dude, you got a Bigfoot on your property," or "That looks like a Bigfoot made it." Well, I don't know that.
Yeah.
It's weird to me, or I wouldn't have taken these pictures and these videos and posted them. I don't have an explanation for it. So let me ask you, let's talk specifically for a second about these stick structures and these nests and things that people find that they claim to be made by Sasquatch. I'm not familiar with any evidence that I've ever been presented with that shows a Bigfoot making a stick structure, right? And I've talked to people who have lots of opinions. Doug Hychek, love him to death. Doug's a good friend of mine. And Doug has these specific types of structures that he thinks they make, and his hypothesis is, and his belief is that these different structures mean different things. I don't know if that's true or not, right? What is your thought on these stick structures that people find and these X formations and things like that, these teepee structures? Do you think that's possible that Bigfoot make these? And what is your opinion on what they are?
Well, with me, I think it's possible that Bigfoot's made them, but as of my knowledge, I don't think there's any witnesses that have personally seen a Bigfoot put one together. So all these are is trace evidence. No one was there when the Bigfoot supposedly built these tree structures. So how are we supposed to know that the Sasquatch made them in the first place? Yes, there's certain things like what if is something strong enough? Is a person strong enough to put that together, or how can they just fall naturally together? Things like that. Well, of course, that might indicate Sasquatch might have made them, but it doesn't prove that a Sasquatch made these tree structures. And once people start making theories on, well, it means this and this and this and this, well, we have no proof of Sasquatch made it in the first place. How can we make theories on an animal that we don't know its psychology? We don't know how a Sasquatch thinks. We only have hypotheses of what they think like. So it's hard to say if these are truly like communication or anything like that if we don't have the proof that Sasquatch made it in the first place. Until the day an eyewitness formally states, "Well, I saw a Bigfoot," put one together, and you have evidence that that person isn't just saying that just to say it. We really have no proof that Bigfoot made it. Like that's like my issue sometimes with with footprints. Footprints, all that is trace evidence. There's not many times where people were actually there and see the Sasquatch put the footprint down. Unless you see that, then you know for sure, okay, that was a Sasquatch who put that footprint down. Like one of my friends gave me the analogy one day. Okay, there's a field in front of you full of snow. Just fell. There's no footprints in it. You walk out to the field. You're like, oh, I want to go get a picture. I want a picture of this. So you go back. You go get your camera. There's footprints you just left. That's trace evidence. You have no. Yes, you know in your mind you left those footprints, but you aren't for sure because that's just trace evidence. Anyone can say, well, anyone else left those footprints. You're the only one there, but it's still just trace evidence. That's kind of the issue with this with Bigfootology and Bigfoot itself is the evidence we're getting at. We're getting a lot of anecdotal and trace evidence, not a lot of empirical or true scientific evidence. And that's like one thing with the tree structures. That's just one more puzzle piece that we don't even know if it should belong to this puzzle or not. So we might have those puzzle pieces that are kind of like red herrings that we believe might be Sasquatch, but might not be Sasquatch in the first place. So that's kind of the issue with like, especially the tree structures, for at least myself.
Yeah, I'm kind of right there with you, man. Sometimes I feel like this puzzle for the Bigfoot phenomena in and of itself is like a 500-piece puzzle set that you get in a box that has a picture on the front, but there's like 75 pieces in it that go to a totally different puzzle, and it just throws you off. You try to put it in this order, you try to put this piece together with this piece, and then it just doesn't fit sometimes. And then you get into the woo part of Bigfoot, which I don't shy away from on my show. I've said that before. You know, if somebody has a UFO encounter and they have these other weird lights and things on their property, and then they have a Bigfoot sighting in addition to that, I'm not saying necessarily they're all connected, but I do believe it's worth at least talking about. And I think that's one of the things that kind of pissed me off about some of the Bigfoot researchers is you start talking about that kind of stuff and they just start shaking their head and they don't even want to be
Yeah,
associated.
their ears get shut off immediately. And I'm like, and I can understand it at some point, but at the same time, all that is data. We don't know what data might help or what data might what hurt. So, like, not to cut you off with that, but that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I understand the scientific approach. You know, people wanted me to get into that sort of philosophical type conversation with Jeff Meldrum, and I'm like, dude, I'm not going to talk to Jeff Meldrum about UFOs and aliens in connection with Bigfoot. That's not why he was on my show. He was on my
Yeah,
show because he's a physical anthropologist who is specialized in human locomotion and bipedal locomotion. That's why he was on the show, for me to have that kind of conversation with him. We're not going to have that sort of philosophical conversation about do aliens exist and is Bigfoot an alien? That's not going to happen. That's for other shows and other people that come on the show, right? And again, I don't necessarily think there's a connection between the two, but like you said, it's data. If people are having these experiences and these encounters, and there's all other layers or multiple layers that go together with those sightings, I think you have to talk about it. And again, it goes back to the stick structures and things that I found on my property. I don't know. I posted 30 pictures of different things that just don't seem natural to me. Doesn't mean that they're not natural. It just doesn't seem natural to me. I don't know enough about the subject and these things in general to even hypothesize where they came from. It's like everything else I do. I put it out there and I let people make up their own minds and draw their own conclusions to what they think. But it leaves me scratching my head. It is weird, right? And I was out here the other night. Those of who follow us on Instagram or are part of the Sasquatch Odyssey fans group on Facebook have seen the postings of the videos that I made out when I did a night hike recently. And I posted some pictures of the sky. Well, I saw some weird lights in the sky that were zipping back and forth in the clearing that I was sitting under. I didn't really talk about it online because it didn't really fit with what I was talking about as far as the stick structures and other things that I'd found in the days leading up to that. But is it connected? Is it just this weird coincidence that I'm finding these things and then all of a sudden I see these things zipping across the sky that I can't explain? Didn't look like planes to me. It wasn't a shooting star, but it was weird, right? And I'm okay talking about it. I'm just not going to necessarily connect that to Bigfoot. And I think that's some of the things that people sort of make the jump and the leap to. And I don't make that leap lightly. I listen to what people have to say, and maybe it is all connected. I don't know, but I think we need to at least talk about it. As far as the new book that you're working on, it's obviously going to be, I'm assuming it is specific to Bigfoot. Why don't you talk a little bit about the project and what you hope to achieve with this book and what's going to be the final outcome?
Well, yes, the book I'm working on right now, the working title is Sasquatch: A Prehistory of a Living Legend. Because with me, I'm really big into the anthropological, the paleontological, and the zoological side of Bigfoot. So in my book, I don't want to talk about like major sightings and passages of film and all these other researchers. I want to talk about, okay, if Sasquatch is real, what is it? It's an ape. Okay, if it's an ape, is it a hominin? Is it a hominid? And that's what I want to talk about in my book. I have 3 or 4 major candidates for Sasquatch, and I want to talk about each candidate, see the likelihood of them being the actual Sasquatch. And I want to talk about like the speculative ecology of Sasquatch. Okay, if these creatures are truly biological species, what is their ecology? What do they eat? Where do they live? What anatomical details and behavioral details do they have? And why do they have these details? Like, for instance, the size of Sasquatch. Most people say these creatures can get up to 9 feet tall. And it's very strange for any type of simian species to be that large. So I speculate on the reason why they get so large. Is it because maybe they're like a last megafaunal species back in the Pleistocene and Pliocene? Being large was the common thing that happened back then. So what if this species is just a surviving like relic of that time of back in the day when the Pleistocene and Pliocene? And if it is, where did it come from? Is it some type of Paranthropus or Australopithecine? Is it part of the Dryopithecine group of glade of apes? Those are things I want to talk about. Also, I want to talk about the Native American stories of Sasquatch because that shows there's also prehistory of legends of the Sasquatch and Sasquatch-like creatures here in North America. So this is kind of a subject I've been researching the past couple years, I'm working on the book now, getting done with the research. About last week, past couple weeks, I've been getting done with the research. I've been talking to a couple researchers in the field that know they're a bit more specialized in certain aspects of this field that I might not know all too much about. So I've talked to them, have them as contributors to the book, and I'm just putting it together within hopefully the next few months. Hopefully, what my goal is trying to get out within the next year. Or so. But I have a pretty full schedule. I have a lot of other things going on, so I hope to get it out soon. But due to the amount of research I'm putting into this book, it might take a little bit longer because I want to make sure it's not junk science. It's not just speculation. It's true mathematical data and data that's been proven through research. That's one thing I want to put in this book. It's not just a bunch of speculation and, well, this person says this person says this. No, the data and the information says this. That's what I want to make sure this book's primarily about. So it's pretty much going to be in a prehistory of Sasquatch, like where did it come from and what's its origins.
Awesome. Well, we'll definitely have to have you back when you get the book done, man. Ryan Edwards, Cryptids of the World. I'll have links in the show notes to get that book, and we'll certainly promote the other one when it comes out, man. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I've had a blast talking to you.
Of course, it's been a great time.
All right, that was good stuff, man. Sorry, I'm a little cantankerous today. I'm normally not like that.
No, you're good. You're good. I get it. Because with me, that's the thing of science. Getting challenged, I don't feel threatened when I get challenged. I'm like, okay, no, if I truly believe my standpoint, if I get challenged with it, then let me just prove my point. Like when people are challenged and they're like, well, get angry about it, that's not the true reason for this research. Don't get angry because that's when zealousness and ego gets into this field. Ego and zealousness should not have a point in science. It's about the evidence, no matter if it's your hypothesis or someone else's hypothesis. Prove your point, and if it's not proven correct, well, then sorry, go back and try to redo your hypothesis. That's just the scientific method. And don't let your ego have a role to play in this.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's why I get so pissed off a lot of times with people in the Bigfoot world because it is all about ego. And it's just so frustrating that we're so far into this. And there are days, like I said, I just feel like I just say, is any of this real? What the hell am I doing here? Because and then I have great shows or I have great interviews, and people sort of challenge me, and it makes me keep going on and doing the research myself and trying to find those answers. But it's tough sometimes because it's just so difficult to find people that want to have a real honest conversation about the science and about what this means or what that might mean or what it doesn't mean or is this connected, all those kinds of questions. People just have this preconceived notion about they know it all, they have it all figured out, and that's just horseshit because nobody knows anything really.
Yeah. Unless you have a Bigfoot body in your backyard, you can't say you know exactly what Bigfoot is.
Right,
That's the
yeah.
thing.
It's like when I post those pictures and stuff that I take on my property, I do find it interesting, and I scratch my head, and my better half's like, I don't even, you think everything's Sasquatch. No, I don't, but it's not, it doesn't appear to be natural, right? But people automatically, fans will say, oh no, you got a Bigfoot on your property. I can't say that, right? Because I didn't see what happened here. But I do find it interesting that it's very similar, that people are finding some of the very same things that I found. I mean, I can find almost identical pictures that I took that other people are posting in other groups. I'm like, well, that either means a the one thing that we have in common is that we all live in the natural world. So if it's similar to what I'm seeing somebody post in Ohio or Idaho or the California, maybe it's because it's natural and it fell that way, or it's a Bigfoot. It's like the only
Yeah.
two options that people go to, right? So, my cop brain and my sort of skeptical brain and sometimes cynical brain goes to that place of, well, it's probably a natural occurrence. And just because it doesn't look natural to me doesn't mean that it's not, right?
Yeah. Like that's like one thing in science people don't realize. There's a saying, correlation does not mean causation. just because these two things correlate doesn't mean one causes another. That's like if you're a 5-year-old and you clap your hands and then there's a clap of thunder. In your little 5-year-old mind, I just thought I just caused thunder. No, those things correlate, but you're not causing one thing to happen. That's one thing that happens a lot in the Bigfoot field. Just because these two occurrences are occurring at the same time doesn't mean one's causing another. That's like my issue sometimes with like UFOs and ghosts and that part of Bigfoot. Well, just because the two things are occurring at the same time doesn't necessarily mean they're causing one another. So you have to look at it from the more, some people have to look at kind of a cynical mind of like, okay, yes, these things are occurring, but are they causing one another? That's something we have to look at it this field.
Yeah, I agree, man. Well, I definitely like your approach to things, and I really do appreciate you coming on. I'll get this turned around in the next couple of weeks and get it out, but I'll certainly shoot you an email, or I'll have Danny send you an email once we get it ready to go.
Of course. Thanks, Brian.
Awesome, man. Well, you have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Thanks much.